the crimes of these individuals, despite them being based in Mexico, are impacting and killing and ruining the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans. Therefore, by nature, it becomes, this international crime, which is also why they're designated FTOs. Big news. President Donald Trump recently signed a directive to the Pentagon, basically authorizing the use of military force in Mexico and Venezuela to target foreign terrorist organizations. That's including the Mexican drug cartels and then Tren de Aragua in Venezuela. This is a big story, and I have all the details and the breakdowns on what my thoughts are and the whole entire analysis. So thank you guys so much for tuning into another episode of Borderland Dispatches, an Ironclad original with yours truly, Katarina Schultz. So on Friday, we found out that this sort of secret directive signed by President Donald Trump has authorized the use of the U.S. military force both at sea and potentially on foreign soil against drug cartels designated as terrorist organizations. There's a long list of them that are based in Mexico, and then you have Tren de Aragua based in Venezuela. Now, this certainly marks a sharp and very blatant escalation beyond these traditional law enforcement tools that we've seen, particularly over the past couple of months since these criminal organizations were declared FTOs in January. Now, President Claudia Sheinbaum, who has been persistent that she is against any form of U.S. military presence on Mexican soil, immediately responded to this directive. And she basically said, we will never allow the U.S. Army to set foot on Mexican soil. And I just kind of want to preface this because I have reported on this a lot, and that's almost purely due to the amount of questions that I have received regarding this since the FTO designation in January. Whether I've been on a podcast, whether it's through social media, wherever, everyone had been asking me, are U.S. Special Forces going to touch down in Mexico? And in the beginning, especially due to the strong rhetoric of how much it appeared they wanted to crack down on the cartels, the U.S. administration, I very much said, yeah, I believe that this is certainly a possibility. This could become a reality. I also never said that this is what needs to happen because, like I've said, something like this could lead to a lot more collateral damage than we're already seeing in Mexico, and it's incredibly significant status quo. So that just concerns me, and knowing that there are a lot of people who don't have the capacity to defend themselves or escape this. But then at the same time, President Claudia Sheinbaum has always been very firm on her stance that this is Mexico's issue and they will deal with it, but they are also completely open and have been receptive to bilateral efforts between U.S. and Mexico to target these cartels, whether that has to do with shutting down the southern border, amping up boots on the ground, and even sending over those 29 major capos to the U.S. that were already in Mexican prisons. That was another example of bilateral efforts, whether that even be extraditions, official extraditions, like we've seen with El Chapo getting into the U.S. to face American justice systems, because essentially, the DOJ, the U.S., the feds believe that the crimes of these individuals, despite them being based in Mexico, are impacting and killing and ruining the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans. Therefore, by nature, it becomes, this international crime, which is also why they're designated FTOs. So let's kind of clear that out of the way. That I think that this is something where if you were to ask me, because I know a lot of you guys will, is this good? Is this bad? And I'm sure a lot of you already have your opinions on it. That's completely fair. That's not my job. It's not my area of expertise to say, yes, this is what needs to happen, or no, boo. I like to see both sides. And I think that something like this, there are certainly some pros in terms of targeting criminal organizations, but at the same time, we can see immense loss. And so weighing those two things becomes a complete moral discussion. And yeah, essentially, this is a really big issue. It's a deep topic, and it's a decision that will affect a lot of people. It's important to keep in mind that there have been, like I said, collaborative efforts between Mexico and the US, even in terms of military operations, okay? There is the Merida Initiative, which basically allows for Green Berets to train Mexican special forces. We've seen this for years, for decades. We've also seen how some of the U.S. Special Force training for Mexican police or military has led to the formation of new and strong criminal organizations. But this new directive essentially represents like a seismic shift in U.S. Mexico relations and strategy. So, from criminal justice to national security slash like military action, designating cartels such as like the Sinaloa cartel, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, CGNG, as foreign terrorist organizations essentially transformed them from criminal networks into state-level threats, which allows the United States to deal with them very differently and to essentially amp up uh, the way they deal with them. They basically can enable tools like military force, sanctions, which we've seen, asset seizures, visa restrictions. This we've been seeing over and over again, particularly over the past couple months, and particularly with Mexican politicians that appear to have narco ties. Also, I want to make it clear that this directive doesn't just impact Mexico. We're going to also talk about Venezuela, and I think that in terms of this directive and this news story, Venezuela is the headline here. And a lot of us are missing that because, we have to shift our focus to Maduro, to Tren de Aragua, to all of the people, the Venezuelan people in the US that are being sent to El Salvador. We're going to get into all of that, all right? But let's continue. What were these like legal levers that have been unlocked with the designation and possibly with this directive? Okay, so there's the Anti-Terrorism Act, which basically means that families of victims, such as like Kiki Camarena's family, can now sue cartel leaders or entire cartels for compensation under terrorism law. I mean, to me, this is more of like a principle act. It doesn't really go into like this deep, impactful action because how are you going to sue the Sinaloa cartel? I mean, you know how many people could probably go and sue ISIS or Al Qaeda? What is that going to do? But I understand the principality behind it. Okay, then you have the asset freezing via the Kingpin Act. I think I did like a whole entire dispatch episode about this because to me, this is extremely significant when you're targeting the financial pipeline. So, cartel affiliated properties and owners and financial instruments can be blocked by the US, which of course cripples finances but also deters corrupt facilitation, ideally. And then you have intelligence and defense access broadening. Okay, so Secretary Marco Rubio has essentially said that the FTO designation has granted access to other elements of American power, whether that be intelligence agencies, the Department of Defense, etc., in terms of these bodies being able to directly target the cartels. Now, here's the overall issue with the directive, especially the issue that we're seeing from the countries that are going to be the targets of this directive. Perhaps targets isn't the best verbiage, but let's stick with it. Textbook, this is a violation of sovereignty. Okay, I know a lot of you are probably going to give me shit for this, but we're going over everything. President Sheinbaum insists collaboration must exclude subordination, or foreign military presence, basically reaffirming that sort of constitutional boundary. Okay. She's literally said, like, they can deal with the cartels in their territory, and we will deal with whatever's going on in ours. And I know that this also sparks a lot of debate because it's like, well, if the Mexican government is going to deal with it, or they are um, open to dealing with it, why haven't they done anything? Why aren't they doing anything? And it comes back to the corruption and impunity discussions that we've been having. And I think that's why a lot of the politicians are now kind of like, oh shit, what's going to happen to me? Because visas are being revoked, assets are being seized. A lot of people are getting outed on social media, or are under a really uh, careful watch by the US feds. And certainly people in power are worrying this crackdown is not now like this fever dream that we were like, okay, maybe it's not going to be as hard of a crackdown as the US is making it out to seem. No, they are cracking down. And I think that what's happened over the last year is honestly more action than we've seen in the last decade, maybe even two. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who would agree with me. As a journalist, one of the biggest challenges I face is cutting through all the noise and bias to find out what really happened. Too often, the same story is reported in completely different ways depending on the outlet and the agenda behind it. That's why for today's episode, I partnered with Ground News. It's one of the best tools to cut through all the noise and find out what's really happening. Check out this article that I found. You can immediately see which outlets picked it up, how they framed it, and even which podcasts are covering it. If there's another topic you're tracking, whether that be cartels, border security, corruption, you can plug it right into the search bar and see the full spread of coverage. Subscribe to get 40% off of the Vantage plan by going directly to groundnews.com/ironclad or by clicking my link in the description. With their bias checker, you can see exactly where a news outlet leans, and with their blind spot feed, you can catch up on stories that may be underreported and that you may have missed. This organizes all of the coverage into one place so you can grasp the full story. It's not about telling you what to think, it's about helping you think critically with context. All right, so there are certain legalities under US law which are going to impact how this directive plays out. First being the Posse Comitatus Act. Guys, sorry I didn't study law, but here we go. We do know what it is, and I'm going to explain it to you. So it's basically like US military involvement in domestic or like quasi law enforcement operations that are restricted. Okay, it requires clear justification. So, in order for US forces to hit Mexican or Venezuelan soil and actually like take on these initiatives to attack who they declare foreign terrorist organizations, there needs to be this clear justification. And I think that finding that justification actually won't be very difficult for them. Certainly when it comes to dealing with like, okay, a regime change, for example, in Venezuela, where Maduro has a $50 million bounty on his head. Okay, that's double the bounty that they put on Osama bin Laden after 9/11. Just imagine that. And then also when targeting drug cartels in Mexico, saying how many people have lost their lives to fentanyl and to cartel violence, I guess could even be one. Even like the crimes going on at the border. I think that justification for this administration is certainly there. Now, another one is there's obviously an assassination ban and war powers, basically meaning that extrajudicial. Now, certainly, of course, we have to talk about the assassination ban and war powers, okay, because extrajudicial killings of suspects, especially civilians outside of combat zones, could, of course, violate both US executive orders and the country in which it's taking place, like their legalities and any executive orders they have and treaties, and then also international human rights. As we're living in a time where it's like war after war in every region of the world, I think we've come to the realization that most of these entities could not give a shit about human rights violations. We've seen this over and over again. You can see it on my Twitter. You can see it all over social media. Um, it's horrible, but it's the reality, okay? And this is something that will likely be considered, but when it comes to in practice, I think that people would rather just do the paperwork and take the hit for committing these violations and, pay whatever fine it is, because really, there aren't many checks and balances that prevent these war crimes from happening, okay? Of course, like I said, there are ethical concerns that come along with this directive. Um, this is a big one for me. It's like the risk of civilian harm, because over the course of my career, I have seen so much human suffering in people who are so far removed from the grim reality that they're living in. And I know that conveying that over camera, and especially when I'm just sitting here explaining it to you, isn't super persuasive, or, it doesn't tug at the heartstrings. But when you see death face to face and get to know a victim and really just like see horrific violence on such undeserving people, like people who should never have experienced this, it changes the way you think. It changes everything. And it's life changing for so many people in horrible ways. So, conducting like foreign military operations against deeply embedded criminal networks, of course, could lead and likely would lead to collateral damage. And of course, that provokes backlash. I couldn't give a shit about backlash. I mean, you see all these people protesting or like condemning groups, and I don't think that does anything, even though we're in like this age of social media where everyone can be vocal and everything is so publicized. I think now backlash is just like reduced to cancel culture type of um, rhetoric where people are just like, okay, get over it. So, really conveying that message that, like, yes, so many people are dying, so they're using this directive as a way to go and combat the people responsible for the loss of life or quality of life is the only option that they have left. It still could lead to further damage. And I wish people could understand that. And I really wish that everyone kind of approached all of these topics with a little bit more compassion for the people who are going to be on the front lines without choosing to be there. Okay. Now, of course, this directive is also being perceived as like intervention. And we've talked about this, how when I report on how there's like CIA planes flying over certain northern Mexican states, or like a US military vessel docked at the port of Veracruz. People are like, oh my God, it's intervention. And it certainly appears that way. And I think that like we're at a point where any little action will garner a massive reaction from the public, because we're all kind of just sitting twiddling our thumbs waiting for this to happen. And this directive is like a breadcrumb of what I believe is to come. So I think that a lot of people are already bracing themselves for this, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Mexican federal government and Claudia Sheinbaum's administration is forming and preparing whatever they need in order to outright call this an intervention and um, an attack on their sovereignty. I want to get into some like historical examples and precedents of this happening, just so that you guys could get a better idea of what something like this could look like and really in the guts what this means. So, Panama, 1989, it was called Operation Just Cause, where US troops ousted Manuel Noriega. It was of course, marked as a violation of international law by the UN for infringing on sovereignty. They went in, they did it anyways, okay? Then you have Operation Snowcap, 87 to 95, the US-led multilateral operation focused on training and support, not direct combat. And then a really significant example that I think mirrors a lot of what this directive is aiming to do in present day would be Operation Snowcap, which was from 87 to 95. It was a counter narcotics operation conducted by the DEA and US Border Patrol Tactical Unit, and then also local military and police forces in 9 different Latin American countries. Um, Basically, it was to deploy army personnel to crack down on drug trafficking, the Medellin cartel, and there was, a significant amount of like drug seizures. It was like very significant also in Bolivia, which at the time was like this hot spot for the trafficking route. I think like over 50 tons of cocaine was seized. It was a lot of thousands of traffickers were arrested. Um, Hundreds of processing or cooking facilities were destroyed, labs were destroyed. Now, of course, you look at something like this, okay, Operation Snowcap certainly is like a more successful example of this type of intervention. But then now we look fast forward a few decades later, and in the grand scheme of things, what did that operation really stop, prevent, or change in the entire landscape of the war on drugs? Nothing. Let's just be clear, really nothing. Essentially, this like narco-terrorism framework was historically used against groups like FARC or Hezbollah, but cartels have evolved into basically like hybrid criminal terror entities. And I think throughout previous dispatches, my explanations of that have made that very clear. And I think that that's why it was so easy to have that justification to designate them FTOs and why so many people were in agreement with it. Even people who are like for or against the administration, no matter where they stand on the political spectrum, this was something that a lot of people believe needed to be done just because of how powerful, expansionist, and modern these cartels have become. And it really did just kind of change the conventional, like the way cartels operate now has certainly changed the conventional definition of what a drug cartel is in the scope of the war on drugs, because they are so much more than that. And you'll see that in their drone warfare and their multiple streams of revenue that expand so much further beyond drugs. All right, let's talk about my favorite topic. Unmasking the cartel politician nexus. The FTO status and this directive essentially would make it easier to track and freeze cartel linked assets that are tied to narco-politicians. This is a really like spicy topic when I bring it up because there are a lot of people who are like assume immediately when I bring this up that I like stand somewhere on the Mexican political spectrum. And it's like, first of all, I am not Mexican. I cannot vote there. And I don't generally even participate. I don't participate in politics. But it's important to note that it doesn't matter which political party it is, what they stand for. I stand against corruption, period. And to this day, there has not been a political party that can prove to me, in the very least, that they also are against corruption. So it doesn't matter which political party is governing, who the candidates are. It's a matter of the actions and what they're doing behind closed doors. Okay. And a lot of the shell companies and properties and money laundering fronts are fronted by politically connected figures. And now we're seeing more than ever a lot of pop star icons, whether it be a boxer, a rapper, a singer. We're going to see more of that coming too. Now, let's get into what this could mean for Venezuela, because there is so much going on in the scope of the relationship between the US and Venezuela right now, and how a lot of what's going on between those two countries has been outsourced to third-party countries, whether that be Venezuelan migrants being deported like to Mexico, or Venezuelan migrants with alleged criminal ties being sent to Secot, the super hyper security max security prison in El Salvador. Now, there's three main entities rooted in Venezuela that the US is particularly paying attention to. Of course, like I said, Tren de Aragua, Cartel de los Soles, and Nicolas Maduro. The US essentially designated Venezuela's Cartel de los Soles, which was ostensibly led by President Nicolas Maduro, as a terrorist organization. Um, the administration imposed sanctions, and then also is now offering a $50 million reward for the arrest, the capture of Nicolas Maduro. I think it's only fair for me to give a little bit of a rundown on really who Nicolas Maduro is and why he's such a large target right now of the United States. The US essentially doubled the reward. I think former President Biden had actually boosted the reward to $25 million during his administration. Trump has now boosted it to $50 million and has accused him of being one of the largest narco traffickers in the world. Imagine being a dictator, the president of this country for so long, and being one of the largest drug traffickers in the world. Crazy resume, okay? Trump has always been a critic of Maduro, and Maduro returned to office in January, following an election that was just, overwhelmed with vote rigging allegations. And the international community, like Venezuela aside, but internationally, um, the results were just completely rejected and believed to be a farce. Attorney General Pam Bondi said that the US would double its reward for the 25 million to 50 million. And she said that Maduro was directly linked to drug smuggling operations. Now, the Venezuelan foreign minister, Ivan Gil, said that the new reward, he called it pathetic. Okay. $50 million reward, yeah, it's pathetic. You have a higher reward than Osama bin Laden. I mean, if anything, it's a fucking ego boost. I'm not gonna lie. But he called it pathetic and said that it's political propaganda. Um, then said, "We're not surprised coming from where it comes from." He accused Bondi of attempting a desperate distraction from headlines linked to the Epstein files. Okay, these, like, really, these guys are going deep. Like, it's like, if you're gonna dish it, you better be able to take it. Now, during Trump's first term, the US government charged Maduro and other high-ranking Venezuelan officials with a range of offenses, including narco-terrorism, corruption, drug trafficking. And then at the time, the US DOJ claimed Maduro had worked with the Colombian rebel group FARC to use cocaine as a weapon to flood the United States, and, like we've talked about before, to deteriorate Western American society. Now, Bondi has publicly accused Maduro of coordinating with groups like Tren de Aragua, and the Sinaloa cartel. And she claimed that the USDEA had seized 30 tons of cocaine linked to Maduro and his associates, with nearly 7 tons linked to Maduro himself, just him. And Maduro has obviously just previously, time and time again, rejected these claims that he has direct involvement in drug trafficking. Now we're here today where this directive almost appears to be a justification or a means to justify a regime change from within Venezuela, with American boots on the ground in Venezuela. We've also seen that, like, the sanctions have lifted. Chevron is now allowed to begin oil drilling again in Venezuela. And I think that we're going to see this major shift. And honestly, all I can say about this is I hope that it is some sort of positive shift for the Venezuelan people, because these people have been suffering for way too long. And I can only be hopeful that this is something that will change the quality of life and the way life operates over there. I'm gonna have to go and see for myself. So, this is kind of like a parallel playbook to Mexico, okay? It's similar to Mexican cartels. Venezuelan criminal power structures are intertwined with political authority. We've seen this with these examples. And it essentially turns into like an arm's length regime change lever, if that makes sense, okay? It also like kind of implicates some geopolitical leverage, sanctions, criminal designations, and reward programs essentially, whether they like it or not, delegitimize Maduro internally and internationally. And we've seen the international community has followed suit with this um, perception, this global perception of Nicolas Maduro. And it kind of creates conditions favorable to accelerate regime destabilizations or transitions. You know, if you have the international community already in agreement that Maduro is a bad guy. He is allegedly a criminal. He is. And Venezuelan people are suffering, and the country is in ruins and is just experiencing way too much political instability and poor quality of life. If the US says, well, we're going in, I think that the international support is there. There's definitely more international support for that type of directive than there is for the whole boots on the ground in Mexico directive. So, what are some like strategic trajectories or like future implications that we can see? Likely, we're going to see an uptick in surveillance, drone tracking, maritime interdiction. And I think that pressure is going to step up while still respecting like sovereign boundaries. But I think this administration is going to kind of push the bill with that. Um, there's certainly going to be enhanced intel sharing, particularly when we're talking about Mexico and the US. We've already seen this amped up, and I think it's going to go a step further. I also think that there's going to be a lot more intelligence gathering from the US without Mexico's permission. We know that this is already happening. A lot of people are like sort of okay with it. We've kind of accepted this as the new reality. And although we'll likely see some like joint effort, boots on the ground stuff, there's going to be a lot happening behind the scenes that Mexico is not going to know about. And we have seen President Claudia Sheinbaum get pretty upset over that with previous scenarios, particularly with El Mayo ending up in the United States. Apparently, they were completely left in the dark. Um, and this kind of continues to happen. So, yeah, there will be coordinated investigations, civil suits, sanctions. We're seeing this, targeting those politicians. But essentially, the US has reframed cartels and these Venezuelan gangs and Maduro as national security threats, okay? They're not just criminal enterprises. There are massive rewards out for the capture of Maduro and major capos. And now, with the January's FTO designation and this new directive sent to the Pentagon, I think we're going to see Pandora's box open. Okay, they've unlocked military, law enforcement, and financial tools and the means to justify whatever actions they're going to take, like it or not. Now, ultimately, in an ideal world, this is how I would put it for you guys, okay? This intersection of enforcement, legal action, and political incentives could, of course, transform the dynamics of corruption and organized crime, but really only if that's carefully calibrated. And I think with the amount of criminal organizations, foreign terrorist organizations, politicians who are going to be concerned, worried, anxious, and angry, it's going to be very complicated to calibrate this in a way. Well, I was going to say that pleases everyone, but that's not going to be the reality no matter what happens. The overall message of this directive is we're coming in hard for these guys and we're going to take them down no matter what it takes, and we don't care who we piss off in the process. We've already seen this happening, and honestly, it's only going to continue to heat up. So thank you guys so much for tuning in to this episode of Borderland Dispatches. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, rate it, and as always, I'll see you next time.